Somebody asked me a very interesting question, and I believe it is also an important question. They asked, how come this man called Rigathi Gachagua looks so relaxed? How come he looks okay? He doesn't look like a person who has just been impeached. Because usually, when somebody is impeached, they will go underground. They'll avoid the public. They'll avoid the journalists. They will take a low profile. Okay? But that is not what Gachagua is doing. Well, some people may explain it by saying that Gachagua started early campaigns for 2027. That may be so, although it is very early to do that. Not strategically a good time to start, in my opinion. However, I have reason to believe, like the person who was asking me this question, that there's something Rigathi Gachagua knows that Kenyans do not know. There is something in the background that is cooking that would make Rigathi Gachagua, the immediate former deputy president, behave in this way. But what is it? I would hazard a guess that it may be linked to some other crazy rumors that have been floating around about Rigathi Gachagua even as he fought his impeachment. It was being said that Rigathi Gachagua's efforts were being financially supported by a very powerful force that was most likely not Kenyan. What? Now, of course, it is very easy to immediately dismiss such a crazy story. Yeah. However, if you have experience in politics, you will know that it is not a good idea to dismiss anything, especially something which sounds very crazy. Because usually, the crazier it sounds, the more likely it will end up being at least close to the truth. Even if it is not the truth, at least somewhere close to the truth. And one very disturbing clue here is how Gachagua, in some of his statements, has been hitting out at the state-sponsored abductions. Indeed, he was the first to come out with that phrase, state-sponsored abductions. Now, there is somebody else currently who has a very well-financed campaign, very visible, against those state-sponsored abductions. Now, I know you may be getting confused, so let us start this story at the beginning. And I assure you that by the end of my show today, you will totally understand what I'm driving at. It's a sensitive issue, although not as sensitive as my very latest special report on a very interesting, super fascinating character, very powerful in our politics, involved in the state-sponsored abductions, involved in the impeachment of Gachagua, etc., etc. By the way, if you've not yet taken in that special report, I strongly recommend that you do everything in your power to get it, because it will really, really open your eyes. You know, reading politics is not easy all the time, and especially now when there are so many things which have happened, and there are so many things which continue to happen. It is very easy to get totally confused. It is also very easy to totally read it wrong, and that is why it is a good idea to dig very deeply during this political analysis, and I do that on this channel. And I beg your patience, step by step, mos, don't get bored. In the end, your eyes will pop open, and you will be able to see things which you may not have seen, or rather which you would never see in a shallow analysis of the situation. Many Kenyans are not aware of this, but it is emerging that the biggest threat to the Ruto regime right now is not even local. Oh yes, We know that the government has many challenges in the country at the moment. Very many. We also know that this government has proved to be incompetent. And that's not propaganda. There is evidence everywhere to prove this. And I'll come back to that in a bit. However, despite all this, it is now emerging, I repeat, that the biggest threat to the Ruto presidency is not even local. And one of the main reasons why many analysts have not sat up and paid attention and noticed what is happening is because most are not aware of how the powerful nations of the West operate. They forget that it is all still politics. You know, politics is a game of deception. Yeah. Unfortunately, in most instances, what you say is not really what you mean in politics, the world over. It is all about selfish self-interest, which comes first, and then everything else is window dressing. And so on my show today, we're going to look a lot deeper into this red hot potato, and prove why it is indeed true that the biggest threat to the current regime is foreign. You know, one of the things that many African leaders forget, and they've forgotten in the past, is that even the rich Western nations supporting African countries have their own political problems and their own political priorities. And so, when their political priorities clash with the interests of their African friends, what decision do you think they will make? But the biggest danger by far for any regime that has been relying heavily on foreign support is the fact, as we have seen in history, is that when these previously close friends of yours realize that you are no longer useful, they usually take active part in removing you. Why? Because obviously they want to position themselves in a good position when that change comes. In other words, they tend to champion the change so that when it comes, they will have favor with the brand new regime. Nothing personal, it's all politics, and that is the way things work. It is very important that we understand that basic truth in order to understand the crazy things unfolding right now for the UDA Kenya Kwanza government. Now, for a relationship to go wrong, there are a number of things that have to go wrong first. And so a very good place to start is to look at the things which have gone wrong for the friends of this regime in their cooperation with this regime. Okay? Number one, the Kenyan regime has become a very heavy financial burden. By the way, super fascinating, the very latest is that this government has already introduced new taxes. That is, new taxes over and above the current situation where Kenyans are already feeling overtaxed. Okay? And some of these measures have been reintroduced through the back door from the aborted Finance Bill 2024. Okay? Bottom line, more taxes coming for Kenyans. Bottom line, the government is digging deeper into the pockets of Kenyans for more money. Now, you know the mystery here is how all the brilliant people in this government have never understood that increasing taxes does not mean collecting more revenue for the government. Indeed, it is a very delicate balance which the moment you get it wrong, then you'll continue collecting less and less taxes, which is exactly what is happening in the Kenyan situation. And therefore it beats logic how even in this situation, instead of reducing taxes to increase collection, the government has decided to take the step of continuing to increase new taxes over the already existing punitive taxes that have already had such a devastating blow on the collection of revenue by the government. I mean, it is no secret, it is no breaking news, that former President Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta used to collect more revenue with less taxes. Anyway, let us stay on point. The issue here is that Kenya is continuing to be a very heavy burden on their friends who supported them, who enabled them to get into power. Kenya has become a very big burden financially. And most significantly, the country has become a burden mostly because of incompetence, making policy decisions that have brought us to this situation. Okay? And to make matters worse, because we're all human, we make mistakes. And to make matters worse, instead of correcting the situation, changing direction, dealing with the mistakes made in the past, learning from them, this government has continued on the same path to raising taxes, introducing new taxes all the time. It is a classic case of trying the same old things which have refused to work and expecting some magic, expecting them to suddenly start working. That is a very accurate description of our situation in the country today. And this thing that has gone wrong, number one on my list, has caused number two, which is the regime has increasingly failed to deliver on their promises to their Western partners. Because the world over, politics is all about deals. Okay, I will get this and you will get that in return. The regime in Kenya has in recent times failed completely to deliver on what was promised. And number three, we need to cut the Ruto regime some slack. This one is not their fault. Although they would have responded appropriately. Okay, but it is not their fault. Number three is that world politics has changed and continues to change at a very rapid rate. Much, much, much faster than has ever happened before in the history of the human race. And some of the changes, they are very major. Like for example, the BRICS manenos. More and more countries are joining by the day. Okay? It is clear that this is not a passing cloud. This is not something that will disappear tomorrow. This is not something that will stop tomorrow. Okay? It is something that appears to be here to stay. Now, very significantly, what all these major changes in world politics means is that the tactics, the strategies of major powers have to change and evolve to deal with the current very fluid situation. And where does that leave Kenya? That leaves the regime in Kenya clutching to the old ways, clutching to the systems that worked before. Okay? And of course, that is not tenable. Just allow me to stop there. I believe it is very clear to most of us that things will never be the same again. Vindu vichenjanga. Now, Bwana Kumekucha Chris, can you show us signs? Can you show us evidence that the firm friendship the Kenya Kwanza regime had or has had with powerful nations of the West is under threat? Chris, show us some evidence. Okay, I will do exactly that. Now today, a major local daily carried a very interesting piece about how there's increased pressure on the government over human rights issues. You know, these abductions that have been going on in the country, yeah, the way protesters have been treated by the police and security agencies during peaceful protests, supposed to be guaranteed by our constitution. And that article quotes various very credible sources to prove that actually there is serious pressure on the Ruto regime about the human rights issue. Now, this is very interesting because if we look back in history, this is usually the first sign that the marriage is on the rocks. Oh yes. And this has happened again and again and again. And the truth is, it is very easy to be fooled that everything is okay, everything is normal. The regime is being fully supported by its Western partners. It is very easy to be fooled into thinking that nothing is happening. And yet, behind the scenes, things are happening. And actually, things are at a very advanced stage. In March 1987, former President Daniel Toroitich arap Moi made a grand tour of the United States of America. And the highlight of that trip was being hosted at the White House by the then President Ronald Reagan. Okay? Now, I want us to look at the chain of events that followed in quick succession after that to prove my point. Okay? Moi was, of course, very warmly welcomed. Okay? And everything seemed okay. President Reagan heaped praise on Moi and his leadership style and the stable situation in Kenya compared to other African countries. And indeed, it must have gotten into Moi's head, because on returning to Kenya, Moi tightened things. Indeed, the following year, 1988, was the year of the infamous Mlolongo elections. Q voting elections, which, by the way, ended up being one of the biggest triggers for the fight for multi-party democracy to start in Kenya. Okay? Now, the super fascinating thing is what unfolded the following year, 1989. Too many things happened. So much so that one cannot say that all of them were coincidences, that all of them were not seen ahead of time by the Americans, powerful allies of Moi at that time. Yeah, too many things happened. But probably the most significant was that the KANU government started paying very close attention to NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Why? Because all of a sudden, our NGOs locally had a lot of money from the same Western power supporting Kenya. They had a lot of money, which was suddenly pumped into human rights manenos, governance, etc., etc. Do you think this was an accident? November of that year, 1989, a man called Smith Hempston was posted to Kenya as the US envoy. Now, let us be clear. Ambassadors and high commissioners never ever take a tour of duty without instructions. Please, let's not forget that. They do not go into a country as an ambassador of their nation to do their own things. Never ever. Now, older Kenyans will remember that Smith Hempston immediately made contact with the opposition, immediately started strongly supporting the opposition, immediately started financing the opposition and strengthening them, against the dictatorial regime of Daniel Toroitich arap Moi. Now hold on a minute. I thought America were Moi's friends. Were they not? Moi had landed at the White House in March 1987 to a very warm welcome by President Ronald Reagan. Things were okay. Kenya was being fully backed by the American government. So, what happened here? Friends, politics. Politics kunaendanga hivyo. And suddenly, very suddenly in Kenya, the momentum for a fight for the country to return to multi-party democracy took off. All of a sudden, out of the blue, there was a very serious movement, very serious support to change the Kenyan constitution. Who do you think was financing all this? Who? Do you think it was being financed by Kenyans? No! This is politics. Bottom line, barely 2.5 years after Moi's grand visit to the White House to be reassured by the Americans, we're with you, barely 2.5 years after that, the Moi regime was in serious trouble. Okay? And backpedaling. Multi-party was reintroduced in 1991. In 1992, we had the first multi-party elections. Do you think all these things are not connected? Do you? But in my opinion, the biggest piece of evidence that the Americans were very interested in things in Kenya politically at that time came in 1997, when Kenya produced its first female presidential candidate, Charity Kaliku Ngilu. The then powerful Secretary General of the all-powerful KANU party at the time said the following: the enemies of Kenya should never imagine, should never think that Kenya is the Philippines. Kenya is a very different country politically. What? What did Kamodo mean? Many Kenyans did not understand what he was saying. And even many in the press, yours truly was a member of the active press then, did not totally understand what Kamodo was saying. But actually, he was referring to earlier, in the year 1986, when a very brutal dictatorial government in the Philippines had been brought down, and a woman had taken over as president. She had won the election. Her name was Corazon Aquino. Now it is said that Mrs. Aquino's campaign was heavily financed by a friendly nation. Okay? And not only financed, the strategy, the approach of that campaign, etc., etc., had technical assistance from a friendly nation. Okay? And so what Bwana Kamodo was saying is that these people who helped Mrs. Aquino were the same people trying to do a similar thing in Kenya through a presidential candidate known as Charity Kaluki Ngilu. Okay? And her political party was called Social Democratic Party, which was a very well-financed party. Nobody understood from where. Or rather, very few people understood from where. Incidentally, one of the prominent members of that political party was a man who is today Kisumu governor, Professor Anyang' Nyong'o. And indeed, it was rumored that he was the point man, that he was the money bags man. Anyway, fast forward to the present. I believe now you'll understand why things may not be exactly what they seem to be. The answers are usually found. In fact, they're usually very clear when you just simply look back at history. Yeah, it tells you a lot of things that you may not know, that you may not be able to see. That is why history is so critical. And so all we have to do now is something which is very easy. and also something which is very difficult, and that is to identify people who are being very well financed to do certain things which may not seem to be in support of the Ruto regime. And what all this means is that people who have been involved in certain operations, it is advisable, my good advice to them, is to start looking for another job. Of course, I'm talking about the people who have been involved in abductions, state-sponsored abductions, etc., etc. My friends, it may be time to start looking for other occupations, for other things to keep you busy. Mapema ndio best. And that is why, in my opinion, it is terribly important to get hold of my very latest, highly sensitive special report. Now, when kipindi cha lala salama, this particular report I will pull off the table at any moment. And of course, part of the reason is the highly sensitive nature of this particular special report. Indeed, regulars on this channel will remember that I have been very hesitant to even give you details of the contents of this special report. Anyway, if you're in a position to, you can see details on your screens right now. Please rush to avoid being shut out and grab this special report today as soon as possible. For a very, very short time, you can get it for only Kenya shillings 1,999. I highly recommend it. Please go for it. Until next time, this is Chris Kumekucha.